Yeah, I know it's great fun.
Ballard's twisted take on the catastrophe story owed much to his experiences as a young boy in Shanghai when it was occupied by the Japanese.
Ballard had seen civilization collapse, and the only course open to him really was to adapt to life in the internment camp. That this what had become normal. If he was going to get through it, then it had to be re-established as the new normality.
He's got this inexhaustible trove of a child's perception of the horror of the destruction of a great city to draw on. So it's as fresh as paint, because he's really writing the same scene over and over again, the same abandoned swimming pool, the same concrete cracked and spalled, the same aimless and disjointed crowds, you know, the same thing, the same absurdist and grotesque juxtapositions of the kind of ordinary and the dreadful that occur at a time like that.
While fellow writers loved Ballard, his novels were far from bestsellers. Rather than getting into readers' heads, his fiction often went over them instead.
I suppose you would say that science fiction is a popular art, but I don't think it's really very popular at all. It puts off the average reader because it has big words like oxygen in it, and I think they would have found Jimmy Ballard's novels particularly opaque, not only because of the elaborate vocabulary, but because of this strange obsessional world that he pictured. It wasn't to most people's liking. I think he did this deliberately, but many of us do this accidentally. But it's nice to have someone who does it as a policy.
Ballard's psychological disasters generated an arcane debate among science fiction writers, fought out in the pages of literary magazines.
I wrote a novel because of a cover I saw on New Worlds once, which said, "What is the exact nature of the catastrophe?" For me, it really summed up exactly what it was about catastrophe novels. What is so bad about the Triffids taking over? Maybe they're the next evolutionary step. When you're writing, there's nothing like having a sort of hailstorm on August Bank Holiday Monday to sort of make people feel a bit nervy and twitchy about the way the world's going. I certainly did this in Fugue. At the beginning, chap has a job and a wife and a child, and he has a house and a mortgage, and by the end of the book he has nothing. And the author's pleasure is really just piling it on and making things much more worse for him and watching him struggle and squeal.
Priest's novel, Fugue for a Darkening Island, returned to one of British science fiction's most troubling themes, race. Following a nuclear war in Africa, countless refugees have engulfed Europe. In Britain, the nation splits into two warring camps, those who welcome the immigrants and those who resent them.
Fugue for a Darkening Island is a very difficult book because Christopher Priest is so directly addressing questions of race in England again. So it, I think, very self-consciously echoes the whole tradition of the catastrophe novel in England, all the way back to Sheil, who was writing about race in the 1890s. Now Christopher Priest, right at the start of the 1970s, is writing about race in England in The Darkening Island, and it is explicitly about the arrival of immigrants.
The political response has always been the idea of trying to alleviate poverty in the third world and trying to redistribute cash. But in actual fact, the problem is self-solving, because what happens, by and large, is that the third world just moves. They just come and live in the first world.
We are now telling the politicians of this country today that we cannot and will not absorb any more
terms like waves of migrants, floods of migrants, swamps of migrants, deluge of migrants. We're aware that these terms work both for catastrophe and for migration, and that what they both have in common is a way of thinking about anxiety and a kind of embattled idea of empire.
Fleeing the conflict, the story's protagonist, Alan Whitman, becomes an asylum seeker in his own country, agonizing over where his sympathies lie. It was not morally right to deny the African immigrants an identity or a voice, and it was now inevitable that the Africans would stay in Britain permanently. On the other hand, the extreme actions of the nationalist side appealed to me on an instinctive level. It had been the Afrims who had directly deprived me of everything I had once owned. Priest's novel was timely. Since the Second World War, the UK's non-white population had increased from a few thousand to over 1 million. Then, in just 2 months in 1972, the year the novel was published, 28,000 African Asians expelled from Uganda arrived in Britain. Their arrival provoked a racist panic amongst some of the white population.
Race is a hot subject. It's always a touchy subject. And for me, it was summed up by Time Out, who reviewed it when it came out. And the review was very positive. And it said, this is telling it from behind the barricades. This is how life in Britain is today.
It's a period of the rise of the National Front, of fascism, of very, very divisive politics, of the end of the post-war consensus, and it's a book that reflects all of those disintegrative elements of society.
But then, a few years later, it came out in paperback, and Time Out reviewed it again. And this time, my novel, which was word for word identical, had now become this sort of racist screed that was, sort of stirring up troubles. And it just seemed to me, well, you can't win. Society changes, life changes, and I was pretty upset about that, actually.
It was a slightly discomforting book to some of its readers, that there were issues in it that they didn't really want to get to grips with, even though the text itself addresses these issues in a very responsible way.
In the book's shocking climax, Alan discovers the brutalized bodies of his wife and daughter. As I walked, my feet were continually sucked by the thick layer of oil on the pebbles. The bodies were not easy to see, and had I not known they were there, from a distance I would have mistaken them for large pieces of congealed oil. They were all black, and they were naked, and all were female. The blackness of the skin was not that of natural pigmentation, but of paint or pitch. I moved amongst them, soon finding Isabel and Sally.
He's totally turned 180 degrees and moved from this initial character who was trying to be an outsider, trying to stay outside of conflict, who was both sympathetic with conflict, and now he's totally embedded in conflict.
I slept that night on the beach. In the morning, I murdered a young African and I stole his rifle. And by the afternoon, I was again in the countryside. For Priest, like others before him, the true catastrophe lies in how brutally we behave when confronted by disaster.
In Fugue, what I wanted to do was to focus on the experiences of one man, and then, at the end of the book, the answer would be implicit. That was the nature of the catastrophe. What happened to him?
After decades of imagining poison clouds, calamitous floods, and appalling viruses, British science fiction began to tire of doom-mongering. But TV drama rushed in to fill the void. The BBC drama Threads, made in 1984, rejected metaphor in favor of realism and destroyed Sheffield in a nuclear strike. This was pure Cold War terror and made a tremendous impact on British audiences.
We are the first people in the history of the world to be aware of the fact that we could be obliterated overnight at the press of a few buttons. And I've certainly grown up with that feeling, this idea that civilization is very thin, it's over.
Jesus Christ, they've done it. They've done it.
There was a sense in which films and novels that dealt with nuclear catastrophe in some way allowed people to imagine the worst, acclimatise them to the dangerous new realities that they were living through in ways that politicians couldn't do.
The public information